Hi guys, July here again with another episode in this podcast series. So today's episode is about a special chat filter that existed for only a few days, and honestly it's a story that's as funny as it is interesting. As I did in the first episode of this podcast series, I should again thank Rap for most of the information in this podcast, as he got it directly from conversations with Andrew Gower himself. You know, the guy that co-created RuneScape, and also the chat filter, back in 2001. I said 2001, so this does mean that we are going to stay in the RuneScape 1 era for this episode as well. Oh yeah, very important, feel free to minimize this screen or continue playing RuneScape or whatever as you listen to this episode. But there will be a point in this video at which I actually do need to show something on the screen. But no worries, because I'll tell you when, so you don't need to pay attention to this window or browser tab the whole time. Okay, so let's begin now then. 2001, so that means RuneScape's first year of existence. So as the size of the community increased quite rapidly, so did the need for moderators and other ways of trying to minimize behavior that breaks the RuneScape rules, which were largely the same back then, by the way. There were some important differences with the rules of today, but maybe I can talk a little about that in another episode. Anyway, so as I was saying, as the community grew, the need for any kind of moderating increased as well, be it in the form of recruiting actual moderators, as I discussed in the first episode of this series, or in the form of implementing systems for that, such as chat filters. That's why in 2001 already, a very primitive chat filter did already exist, but there was a problem, and it's a problem that kept getting worse and worse the more the community grew. So in November of 2001, Andrew Gower decided to do something about that with what I guess we could describe as an ambitious project. So by November of 2001, the community had found too many ways to circumvent the chat filter that already existed. In addition to that being a problem just in the context of wanting to provide a peaceful and respectful environment, Andrew also feared that exposing the community to verbal abuse by other players could lead to him getting sued, which is another reason why he wanted a much improved chat filter. The first idea that he had was to work with a combination of templates and whitelisted words, or wildcards. And now you need to look at the screen, because throughout the next minute I'm going to show some examples, just so that it's easier for you to understand how all this worked. And of course I'll tell you when you can look away again. So for example, one of the templates was $verb $me a $noun $, as you can see on the screen, in which the verb and the noun had to appear on a list of allowed words, such as in the example, give me a sword, which follows that template as it's first a verb, which is give, then me a, and then a noun, which is sword. And that's how templates had to be created. All the vocabulary that was allowed would be restricted to all that would frequently be used in RuneScape. For example, for the wildcard $noun that meant locations, NPCs, objects, skills, etc., all of which had their own wildcards as well. So just to be clear, a template in this context meant a single grammatical syntax in which any word could be used that is covered by the wildcard. Any other phrase or grammatical structure would require another template to be made. For example, and I'm going to stop saying the $signs now, the phrases I am level nam skill, obju for sale, can I buy obju, ? Follow me, etc. are all separate templates in this system. This means that Andrew needed to create a huge number of templates to cover all conversation scenarios. That was extremely difficult because, as you can imagine, phrases and sentences often have variations or semantic equivalents as well. For example, there was also a template, do you know where obju is? ? But with just that being allowed, the semantic equivalent, do you know where I can find object ? Which actually means exactly the same thing, would not be allowed by the chat filter because that was a different template, so that needed to be another template that Andrew had to create for it. So eventually you would end up needing a huge list of such templates, which is why I called it an ambitious project a few minutes ago. And of course you realize that creating all those templates would take up a lot of time. So it wasn't a very practical or convenient thing to do to begin with. By the way, you can look away again now. I won't need to show anything else on the screen anymore in this episode. So Andrew's plan was to create a gigantic ASCII file. I think that's how you pronounce it. ASCII. I think it's ASCII, but let me know if that's wrong. So I'm going to call it ASCII file in this episode. So as I was saying, Andrew's plan was to create a gigantic ASCII file that would contain all templates or all phrases and structures that would be allowed by the chat filter, which means that both grammar and vocabulary would be heavily restricted. And that went quite far. For example, abbreviations and chat language or slang would not pass the chat filter. Adjectives would not be allowed either because they could be easily abused, but there were still exceptions for RuneScape specific adjectives, such as mithril in, for example, a mithril sword. Numbers were a problem as well because they could be used as letters, but there was no way to restrict that. Andrew realized that he should also have a wildcard for usernames, but the problem with that was that abusive or offensive usernames would get through as well then, instead of being filtered out. So as a potential solution, Andrew considered a system of restricted usernames so that players could no longer have certain usernames, but he eventually decided that went a little bit too far, so that was never incorporated into the system. Anyway, if a player tried to enter a phrase that was not included in the ASCII file, the game would return the message, "Sorry, I don't recognize that sentence." But there was no way to know in advance if any specific phrase had been included in that ASCII file or not. The eventual objective of having such a strict chat filter is that RuneScape would become auto-moderator, as phishing, spamming, verbal abuse, etc. would not get past the chat filter anymore. Andrew knew that that would be an immensely unpopular system, but, and perhaps it is a little strange to say, he did not mind losing players because the servers had been struggling to support the size of the community anyway. In other words, RuneScape had become too popular and the game servers could not handle it anymore. In fact, a little earlier in November, Andrew had placed a limit of 1,200 players on each server, just to stabilize all servers. The servers previously had no player limit, but each of them would get extremely laggy once around 1,500 players were using the same roles. So 1,200 was chosen as a safe upper limit. With RuneScape having 4 game worlds at that point, that means that a maximum of 4,800 players could be online simultaneously, which is a limit that was reached in no time, by the way, so Andrew still needed to order more servers in the end. But let's talk about the chat filter again now. So the chat filter with its templates never made it into the game. Why? Well, after testing it, Andrew decided to scrap it because, and this may come as a surprise to you, it was not working well enough. But he did not give up. So the problem was that the templates would have restricted both grammar and vocabulary, and that was just too difficult. So Andrew instead decided to limit just the vocabulary, but not the grammar anymore, so that it would no longer be needed to use templates for the syntax, because that is essentially grammar. So instead, any combination of around 3,500 whitelisted words would now be allowed, which later in the development phase increased to 4,000. We actually use a lot more words than that to communicate in real life, but 4,000 was considered enough because the players would not need to use most of the words that they knew anyway. With the new system, instead of blocking disallowed words or filtering words so that they don't show up anymore, any of such words would instead be autocorrected into the nearest morphological match. So that is the word that looked the most similar in terms of spelling. It is not known, however, if this included RuneScape specific vocabulary as well, such as the names of locations and NPCs. That would not be surprising though, because believe it or not, but even the word RuneScape was not allowed anymore with this new chat filter. So the chat filter was still supposed to be heavily restricted, so abbreviations and chat language were still not allowed, and even smileys were restricted as well. Andrew also did not want anyone to be able to refer to real life, which is why he went as far as to ban the words real and life. He also wanted to make threats, such as death threats for example, impossible, but he could not ban the word kill because of its use in RuneScape in the context of mainly PvP at the time. After playing around with the filter, the worst sentence that Andrew managed to sneak past the chat filter was, "I am going to kill you and I am not talking about in the game," which is why he decided to ban the word game as well on top of RuneScape. By the way, the chat filter could not always find a nearest match when a certain word wasn't allowed, so then the banned word wouldn't have another word to turn into. When that happened, the chat filter would instead generate the word cabbage, because Andrew had a fascination with cabbage for one reason or another. All swear words would become cabbage as well. So that version of the chat filter, which was essentially a dictionary that forced players to spell correctly, was eventually added to the game on the 14th of November of 2001, that is, and filtered both public chat and private chat. Perhaps not surprisingly, the community managed to bypass the chat filter on day one already, such as S with a single S and then followed by whole to say you know what. The concept of restricted vocabulary was not enough either, for example rap, and remember he had helped Andrew with the chat filter, so rap spotted a player who managed to say bend over and take it, and you know what it is, so the system clearly was not perfect. And something that you might wonder as well is, what if a player accidentally typed a word wrong? Well, that would also be autocorrected into the nearest match, which may not have been the word that was meant to be said by the player. Another problem is that no one ever speaks perfect English, and even if the chat filter took that into account by also allowing grammatically informal derivatives or colloquial English in general, there was absolutely no way that the new chat filter could include all of those ungrammatical alternatives that were commonly used in games. And also, foreign players who may or may not speak English well enough would not be allowed to chat in their native language either, so that was a huge weakness of the system as it essentially only allowed English language. Anyway, a side effect of the chat filter is that it also filtered and autocorrected usernames when trying to say them, well, spell them that is. So most players suddenly had a second name, which is the word that the banned words, so to speak, auto-morphed into. For example, Rap himself, which you spell R-A-B by the way, became Raw, and another player called DJ Dog with a double G became Doodoo. So that is how many players ended up with a second name essentially. And this also means that many players could no longer be addressed by their actual username. Although these alternative names might have been hilarious, the update as expected received a lot of criticism. Probably no one liked it. That is why Andrew tried a second version of the chat filter, but there were just too many problems with the system that could not be properly fixed. So just a day later, so on the 15th of November, Andrew removed the new chat filter. Yes, you heard that right, so all that work and effort for something that lasted only a day. That said, Andrew further mentioned that he had found another way of filtering that would be far more effective than using a limited dictionary, but it is not known if that new system made it into the game at one point or another. By the way, the unique property of the restricted chat filter that turned unmatched words or swear words into the word cabbage is why the system was later nicknamed the Cabbage filter or the Cabbage chat filter. A funny anecdote about that is that there was an error in the system when Andrew was still testing it, and that error led to all words, including the whitelisted words, being turned into cabbage at one point. If that had made it into the game by accident, then all that the players would be seeing in the private chat and public chat would be the words cabbage, 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 cabbage. And I think you get the point, so a lot of cabbage and nothing else. So there you have it, the history of the somewhat hilarious Cabbage chat filter. A lot of hard work for little to no result, so that's unfortunate, but the game survived and so did the community for many years without the Cabbage chat filter. I guess what's important to take away from this story is that Andrew seemed very idealistic about the game that he wanted to create, and it's probably that mindset that lies behind the success of RuneScape. So back in November of 2001, he may have lost one battle, but he definitely ended up winning the war with all his dedication to the game and its development. That was all for today. Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments. If you enjoyed this episode, consider liking and subscribing. That would really help this channel. And you can always follow me on my social media pages as well. So thank you for watching. I am July and I hope that you will come back for more.